Let me give you a title to this evening's sermon. It might help in order for you to begin to understand the process I'm going to go through. We're going to talk about the theological and moral implications of dealing with the coronavirus. It's important that I deal with these issues because as things develop, more and more questions are coming about regarding moral issues concerning especially the manufacturing and use of vaccines. First of all, in this gospel passage, we have a wonderful example of intercessory prayer. Here is a woman, her daughter is possessed by a demon. She's begging Jesus to help her daughter. And we oftentimes, especially a priest, will have people say, "Father, please pray for me." And that's an intercessory prayer. You're interceding with God, either on your own behalf or on behalf of someone else. So intercessory prayer has a very long history in the church. Here we are dealing with one who is possessed by an evil spirit, but we also see intercessory prayers in the gospel when Jesus is asked to heal someone who is sick. It is the long history of the Judeo-Christian tradition, as we find it in the scriptures, that intercessory prayer is something that we are encouraged to be involved with, so that we can look at Bible stories and see that people begged God for mercy. People begged God for healing. People begged God to preserve them from natural calamity or from a plague. And I suppose we can say right now, we are in the midst of a plague. And therefore, we have an obligation, not just an obligation, we should know that we can go to God and ask God to save us from the ravages of this plague, known as the coronavirus or COVID-19. I'm going to make a few remarks now that I know hindsight is 20/20, but let me just say to you that there are some areas where the churches, not just the Catholic Church, but the churches and I suppose the synagogues have fallen short of their obligation to promote intercessory prayer. Not that we haven't tried to a certain degree of praying to end the virus, the plague, whatever you will. But instead of confronting it head on through intercessory prayer, we seemed to have backed off. And so what did we do? We closed the churches. Now, as I look at this now, it was probably the wrong thing to do. As I said, hindsight is 20/20. But hopefully we've learned a lesson for the future. Something else that we did that I felt uneasy with it when we did it. I could almost understand it, but I was uncomfortable with it, and that was suspending the Sunday obligation. Now, let's talk about that Sunday obligation. We have a responsibility to worship God. We talked about that in the past. Worshiping God is not something that we do for God's benefit. It's for our benefit as creatures, and we owe it to God. It's not a favor. It's not a favor to God. Now, church has always preached common sense. If you are sick or you are in a fragile condition, use your common sense. Don't come to church. Stay home. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that we have to be responsible people. And so, what should we have done? Well, we're doing it. Wear masks. sanitize your hands, have social distancing. We could have done those things, and I dare say we probably would be in the same situation that we are in right now. But I think that we kind of missed the boat there. There also could have been a substitution for, or in addition to, going to Mass. And what we should have done was encourage people to enter into, if they were not going to attend Mass, into prayer and fasting. We didn't hear much about that. Maybe we heard some people say a few prayers, special prayers. We did it here when we were live streaming. Maybe we saw it on Facebook. But did we hear enough about our obligation for prayer and fasting? Or perhaps some kind of a group effort with some social distancing, if you will, and masks, to have a procession, a rosary procession, begging God's mercy. That has been the long tradition of the church. I think we missed the boat. We gave in to fear, and we gave in to what we call today the scientific mentality, and it kind of left out the transcendent, the sacramentality, that we need to be in touch with the sacred, and that the sacred can act and work on our behalf to save us from natural calamity, to save us from the plague, to save us from sickness. Okay, that's the first part. I think we can all follow that reasoning. Second part gets a little more difficult, and I hope not confusing. I'll try to be as simple as possible with this. It has to do with, what do we do with medical, moral issues during a time like this, during a time when we are suffering from a pandemic? A pandemic, that's what this is. It's a worldwide thing, worldwide virus. We have been given by God great mental abilities. And we encourage, as a church, we have always encouraged. And certainly the Jewish tradition has always encouraged the development of the human mind, especially when it comes to the use of medicine. Because why? We're made in God's image and likeness, and the medicine is there to help God's people. So the Judeo-Christian tradition has always encouraged a wise use of medicine and to use science for the benefit of human beings. All right. Certain questions now arise. What about the development of a vaccine? A good idea for some people. Some people might be opposed to any kind of vaccine, but I'll try to talk about that in a little while. Question now comes, can a vaccine be derived from an aborted fetus? And this discussion has been going on now for some time, since the idea of creating a vaccine has come more and more into the vogue, or into the discussions regarding what does science do to fight the coronavirus. Now, the church's teaching is this regarding vaccines. There is no rule against a vaccine. So over the years, from time to time, I've had people come to me, and they'd call me up when I was in the bishop's office and say, we want an exemption from, a religious exemption from being vaccinated, say in order to go to school. Catholic Church does not have an exemption from vaccines. I couldn't give you a certificate saying you're exempt. Now, some churches do that. And usually the state honors a religious exemption. Florida will honor a religious exemption against vaccination. But the state has other means in order to enforce laws for the public good. Okay, there has to be a compelling public interest in order for the state to recognize the rights of religion over the laws of the state. So, what can the state do? Well, the state can put somebody into quarantine. You can't come to school because you're not vaccinated. You could put somebody into isolation because you are a carrier of a disease. So there's different things that the state and I suppose school systems can do during a time of a pandemic that they would say is to protect the general population. But the Catholic Church does not have that. The caveat that we do have, though, is that we would say it is immoral for science, scientific laboratories, or government to produce vaccines from fetuses that were deliberately aborted to get the vaccine. Deliberately aborted. And that would be found in Dignitatis Personae 2007. And it states it there very clearly. Now, could somebody then make a case that because this vaccine comes from aborted fetuses, I will not take this vaccine? They might, but I don't think that we would be able to, as a church, support that in court, from what I have read thus far. Because they can say that the vaccines were not derived from fetuses, but they were derived from historic stem cell lines. And these are already existing stem cell lines, and it would be very difficult for us to know what laboratory they came from, what country they came from. In the United States, in 2001, President Bush gave a very solemnic ruling and said no more use of aborted fetuses to make new stem cell lines, but you could use the historic stem cell lines. So because it is one step removed from taking the matter of the aborted child to make the vaccine, I think it would be very difficult for us as a church to say that the church is opposed to me taking the vaccine. I hope we understand that, okay? Now, what about forcing vaccines on people? This becomes a little more difficult. First of all, let me say this very clearly. If someone does not want to be vaccinated, the state has no right to violate bodily integrity. What does that mean? It means that the state can't force you, hold you down, restrain you in order to vaccinate you. Okay? That is the traditional belief, not only of the church, but of our government, that you could not be forced under restraint to be vaccinated. It violates your bodily integrity. Now, when we talk about this, once again, we can say the church would say that the state can do other things. Quarantine, isolation. There was a case way back in the beginning of the 20th century, you might have heard of Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary, she was a non-symptomatic carrier of typhoid. And she was warned numerous times that she should not take cooking jobs. She was a cook for some wealthy families in New York City. And finally, the state isolated her and put her on a small island with a house in the Upper East River. And that goes back and forth regarding, human autonomy. But the state was able to do that. We have here in Florida, laws that say that, people should be vaccinated. As I said, you have a religious exemption. But we also talk about quarantine. We talk about isolation, that the health officials have the right to do everything they can to stop the spread of the disease, including isolation, quarantine. Now, there is a statute. It goes this far, and people have been calling me about this. Not the average layperson, but people who are trying to deal with this stuff. They tell me in the Florida statute, I've got to remember the statute now, be patient, 381.0000315, 313 to 315. This is recorded, so maybe you want to look it up when you go home. And it talks about doing everything possible to get somebody vaccinated, everything possible. And it seems to include force. That is not tolerated. It is intolerable. That can never happen. I don't think with our present governor that should be a concern. But we don't know what's down the road with a different administration and different mind thought. So as we go through this coronavirus, the problem is how many of our natural rights, our civil liberties, our human rights are we willing to sacrifice? That's kind of like that story, I'm not sure it's true, about the frog in the boiling water. You just turn up the heat gradually, and the frog doesn't even realize what's happening to him, and finally he's a dead frog. And so as we go through this, we have to be very careful about the medical, moral issues that we are going to be confronting. The last thing I'll say is this, and this is something we have to deal with at another time. It is the fact that death becomes more apparent to us. And I don't think the church is taking the opportunity that it should in order to deal with the topic of death. What happens to us after death, how we should be prepared for death. For those of us who we reach a certain age, it's something that we should all think about. So that'll be a topic for another time, how we should prepare for death and what happens to us after death. What made this very real for me is we had a number of funerals over the past week, and I was talking to some of the funeral directors, and they tell me that they're 10 days behind in cremations. So there are a lot of people who have died, and it's something that we as individuals, but especially as a church, that we must deal with. God love you.